Somewhere over the black water south of Sicily, a young pilot holds his C-47 steady at 1,500 feet. The night of July 11th, 1943 is warm, the air thick with the salt smell of the Mediterranean, and through the scratched windscreen the coastline ahead glows an unnatural orange where fires still burn from the landings that began the day before. Behind him, in the fuselage stripped of everything but aluminum bucket seats and a static line, sit 36 paratroopers of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. Their faces are blackened with cork, their pockets bulge with ammunition, rations, morphine syrettes. They have been told to expect flak over the drop zone near Gela, and they have been told, assured in fact by the operations officers who briefed the mission, that the Allied fleet below has been notified of their route, their altitude, and their timing. They are expected. They are friendlies. The ships know they're coming. The first trace around comes up from the sea like a slow red firefly, and for one full second no one understands what it means. Then the sky fractures. From the darkened hulls of American destroyers and Liberty ships and the freshly dug gun pits of Army anti-aircraft batteries ashore, a curtain of fire erupts that one survivor will later describe as a solid wall. 40mm Bofors rounds, 20mm Oerlikon fire, and the heavy punch of 3-inch naval guns all reaching upward into the formation of 144 unarmed transport planes, flying low, slow, and straight toward the very beaches they have come to reinforce. There is no evasion at this altitude, no room to dive, no speed to outrun the tracers. The C-47, that most reliable and most defenceless workhorse of the Allied air fleet, cruises at roughly 150 miles per hour, a pace so leisurely that the gunners below barely need to lead their targets. In the holds of the transports, paratroopers feel the airframes shudder as shells punch through aluminum skin. Hydraulic fluid sprays across boots. A man sitting against the fuselage wall watches a hole appear next to his head, ringed with torn metal, and the warm night rushes in. 23 aircraft tumble from that sky. Some spiral into the sea trailing fire. Others, struck in the engines or the cockpit, simply nose over and fall, carrying every man inside to a death that has nothing to do with the enemy. Lieutenant Colonel Bill Yarborough, commanding one of the battalions aboard those transports, will remember watching planes around him come apart in the barrage, seeing them, his word, tumble out of the air like burning crosses. The phrase lodges in the memory because it is so precisely visual, so accidentally sacred, and so final. The men inside those burning crosses are not killed by the Wehrmacht. They are killed by the United States Navy. They are killed by their own army's shore batteries. They are killed by gunners who have been briefed on the overflight, who have been ordered to hold fire, but who cannot, in the terror and confusion and roaring darkness, distinguish an American transport from a German bomber. By the time the barrage lifts, and it lifts only because the surviving planes scatter in every direction, some pilots turning back toward North Africa, others dropping their paratroopers wherever they can, some men jumping from aircraft that are already on fire, 318 Americans are dead, wounded, or missing. 318. The number belongs not to a battle against the Axis, but to a catastrophe of recognition, a failure so fundamental that it will echo through every air operation the Allies plan for the next 11 months, through the skies over Salerno and Anzio and the English Channel, until it reaches its final, desperate answer in the form of 5 hand-painted stripes on the wing of every Allied aircraft that flies over Normandy on the morning of June 6th, 1944. But that answer is still a year away on this July night, and in its absence the question hangs in the air like the acrid smoke of spent flak rounds drifting over the Mediterranean. In the crowded, chaotic airspace of combined arms warfare, how does anyone know whose plane is whose? It is a question that should not need asking. Armies have always marked their own: flags, pennants, coloured sashes, insignia painted on shields. The principle is ancient. But the airplane has introduced a variable that no previous century of warfare had to reckon with: speed. A knight on horseback approaches at perhaps 30 miles per hour, and his heraldry is visible at 100 yards, and there is time, several seconds at least, to read the device on his shield and decide whether he is friend or enemy. An aircraft in 1943 approaches at 300 miles per hour or more, and it is not 100 yards away but thousands, a dark shape against a darker sky, visible for a handful of seconds before it is overhead and past, and in those seconds a gunner on the deck of a destroyer or behind a Bofors mount on a beachhead must make a decision that cannot be unmade. Shoot, and the shape might be a Junkers 88 on a bombing run that will kill 50 men. Hold fire, and the shape might be a Focke-Wulf 190 about to strafe the deck. Shoot, and the shape might be an American C-47 full of American paratroopers. By the summer of 1943, the problem has become structural. The great industrial democracies and the Axis powers have, through the convergent pressures of aerodynamics and engine technology, arrived at aircraft that look, from a distance, remarkably alike. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the 8th Air Force's primary fighter, is a massive blunt-nosed machine powered by a Pratt & Whitney R 2800 radial engine. Its silhouette, seen from below or at a quartering angle, presents a round cowling, a broad wing, and a thick fuselage that bears an uncomfortable resemblance to the Focke-Wulf FW-190, Germany's best radial engine fighter. The FW-190 is lighter, smaller, and faster in a roll, but at altitude, at speed, against a clouded sky, the difference between the two shapes collapses. A gunner looking up through the smoke of his own muzzle flash, his ears ringing, his hands on a weapon that fires 400 rounds per minute, does not see the subtle differences in wing taper or tail profile that a recognition manual illustrates so clearly on a calm afternoon in a classroom. He sees a silhouette, and the silhouette says enemy. The identification manuals are everywhere by 1943. Every ship's wardroom, every anti-aircraft battery, every fighter squadron ready room has them. Booklets showing aircraft in plan view, front view, side view, and three-quarter view, each labelled with its name and nationality. The system is called silhouette recognition, and it is the primary means by which the men who operate anti-aircraft weapons are expected to distinguish a P-47 from an FW-19, a Spitfire from a Messerschmitt 109, a C-47 from a Junkers 52. In theory it works, the shapes are different. The wings of the FW-190 have a distinctive taper. The P-47's wing is wider and more elliptical. The tail assemblies are not the same. In a well-lit room, with clean printed cards and an instructor pointing out the features, the differences are obvious. But the well-lit room bears no resemblance to the conditions under which these identifications must be made. The gunner on a ship off Gela is not in a classroom. He's on a deck that shudders with the recoil of nearby mounts, in darkness broken only by muzzle flash and the reflected glow of fires ashore. And the aircraft above him is not a clean silhouette on a printed card. It is a shadow, moving, at an angle the manual never showed, its engine noise swallowed by the cacophony of battle. Under these conditions, silhouette recognition is not a system, it is a hope. There is supposed to be a technological solution. It is called IFF, Identification Friend or Foe, and it is an electronic transponder fitted to Allied aircraft that responds to a coded interrogation signal from ground or ship-based radar. When the system works, a radar operator can see a blip on the screen and confirm that the aircraft carrying that blip is friendly. The IFF Mark III is the standard model in service by 1943, and it represents a genuine leap in the ability to sort the sky into categories. But it has limits that are, in the context of a major amphibious operation, crippling. The system is prone to saturation. When thousands of aircraft operate in a confined airspace, fighters, bombers, transports, reconnaissance planes, all converging on the same few square miles of coast. The IFF signals overlap, bleed into one another, and become unreadable. Worse, not every aircraft is fitted with a working transponder. Sets break. Sets are removed for maintenance and not replaced before a mission. Some aircraft types are never fitted at all. And even when the transponder works, the information it provides reaches the radar operator, not the gunner. The man behind the Bofors gun does not have a radar screen. He has his eyes, his ears, and whatever shout comes down the chain of command from the radar plot. A shout that must travel through noise, confusion, and the fog of battle, and that arrives, if it arrives at all, seconds too late. So the gunner falls back on the only tool he trusts, his own vision. He scans the sky. He sees a shape. He recognizes a shape, or believes he does, and he fires. And because the cost of hesitation may be his own death and the deaths of the men around him, he fires fast. The results over Sicily speak for themselves. What makes the catastrophe of July 11th, 1943 so searing is not merely its scale. 23 planes, 318 casualties, but its preventability. The overflight route had been planned. The naval commanders had been briefed. Orders had gone out, explicitly and repeatedly, that the fleet was to hold fire during the time window when the C-47s would pass overhead. And yet the orders were not enough. Hours before the transports arrived, German aircraft had attacked the fleet off Gela, and the gunners had fought back, and the adrenaline was still coursing through them, and the sky was still full of noise and uncertainty. When new shapes appeared overhead, shapes that were, in fact, American transport planes flying the announced route at the announced altitude at the announced time, the gunners did not consult their orders. They did not wait for IFF confirmation. They opened fire because they had been attacked from the air earlier that night, and these shapes in the sky were coming from the same direction, and no one had given them a way to tell the difference that was faster, more visceral, more immediate than the fear already pounding in their chests. This is the anatomy of a friendly fire disaster. It is not a failure of courage or discipline. It is a failure of systems, a gap between what the human eye can perceive under combat conditions and what the chain of command assumes it can perceive, between the theoretical reliability of an electronic transponder and its actual performance in a saturated electromagnetic environment, between the clarity of an order issued in a planning room and the chaos in which that order must be executed. 318 men die in that gap, and the gap is not new. It has been there since the first anti-aircraft gun was pointed at the first airplane, in every theatre of every war fought since 1914. What is new in the summer of 1943 is the scale. The Allies are conducting operations that put thousands of aircraft over a concentrated naval force in a confined space, and the technology of visual recognition and electronic identification cannot keep pace with the density of that airspace. The C-47 transports over Sicily are only the most visible victims. Across the Mediterranean theatre, combat reports pile up with accounts of Allied fighters and bombers fired on by Allied ships and ground units. Pilots return from missions with flak damage that did not come from the enemy. Some do not return at all, and the after-action reports list them as lost to unknown causes, a bureaucratic phrase that sometimes conceals the terrible truth that the cause was American. A board of inquiry convenes to investigate the Sicily disaster. It is chaired by General Leslie McNair, Commanding General of Army Ground Forces, a man whose authority spans the entire training and doctrine apparatus of the United States Army. McNair is not a man given to sentiment. He is an artilleryman by training, precise and analytical, and his task is not to assign blame to any single gunner or ship captain, but to understand why the system itself produced this outcome. The board's investigation is thorough. It examines the communications chain, the timing of the overflight, the sequence of events on the ships, the state of alert following the German air raids. It interviews gunners, radar operators, naval officers, and surviving pilots. The central finding is devastating in its clarity. The board does not point to a single point of failure, a missed message, a panicked commander, a broken radio. Instead, it identifies something worse, a systemic deficiency. The Allied military, the board concludes, lacks a reliable, universal visual identification signal that can tell a gunner, instantly and unambiguously, that the aircraft overhead is friendly. No amount of briefing, no volume of radio traffic, no strictness of orders can substitute for such a signal. The problem is not that the orders were unclear. The problem is that orders alone cannot override the instinct of a man under fire when his eyes tell him he sees the enemy. The finding is a rebuke not of individuals but of an entire approach to combat identification. The military has relied on a layered system: operational orders, IFF transponders, silhouette recognition, and every layer has failed simultaneously under the specific conditions of a major combined arms operation. The orders were issued but could not penetrate the chaos. The transponders were fitted but could not function in the electromagnetic noise. The silhouettes were studied but could not be read in the dark. And in the absence of a system that works, men default to fear, and fear defaults to fire. McNair's board makes recommendations: better communication protocols, more rigorous training in aircraft recognition, improved coordination between air and naval commands. These are sensible, necessary measures, and they are implemented. But the board also identifies the one recommendation that matters most: the development and adoption of a high-visibility identification marking, a visual signal so large, so bold, so unmistakable that it can be read not by a man studying a recognition card in a classroom, but by a man on the trigger of a 40mm gun in the dark, at range, under fire, in the 2 or 3 seconds before he must decide whether to shoot. The board does not specify what this marking should look like. That decision is still months away. But the principle is established in the blood-soaked aftermath of Sicily. The next time Allied aircraft fly over an Allied fleet during an invasion, there must be something on those aircraft that screams, instantly and visually, that they are friendly. Not an electronic signal that might fail. Not a briefing that might be forgotten. Something painted on the metal itself, visible to the naked eye, readable in a heartbeat. It is a principle that sounds simple. A painted marking. A visual code. How difficult can it be? The answer, as the Allies will discover over the months between Sicily and Normandy, is extraordinarily difficult, not because paint is hard to apply, but because every elegant solution to the identification problem creates a new problem of its own. A marking that is visible to friendly gunners is also visible to enemy fighters. A marking that is standardized across all Allied aircraft is also a marking that the Luftwaffe can study, replicate, and exploit. A marking that is ordered weeks in advance risks being compromised by espionage. And a marking that is applied to thousands of aircraft in a theatre of operations requires an industrial quantity of paint, a workforce of painters, and a logistical chain that does not exist. These are the problems that will preoccupy Allied air planners for the next 11 months, through the landings at Salerno and Anzio, through the long build-up to the invasion of France, until the solution is finally ordered on a spring day in 1944 and executed in a single frantic night on the rain-slicked airfields of southern England. But in July of 1943, on the morning after the catastrophe, none of that machinery is yet in motion. What is in motion is grief and anger and the particular horror of men who have survived being shot at by their own side. The paratroopers of the 504th who made it to the ground, some dropped on their assigned zone, many scattered across miles of Sicilian countryside after their pilots swerved to escape the barrage, reassemble in the days that follow. They fight. They take their objectives. They perform with the ferocity that the 82nd Airborne is already becoming known for. But among them, there is a wound that combat with the Germans does not inflict. The knowledge that the greatest danger they faced came not from the sky above, not from the enemy ahead, but from the fleet behind them. The fleet that was supposed to be covering their advance, the fleet that was supposed to know they were coming. Lieutenant Colonel Yarborough's phrase, burning crosses, enters the informal lexicon of the airborne community, repeated in mess halls and officers' clubs, a shorthand for a betrayal that no one intended but that 318 men paid for. It is not a phrase that appears in official reports. Official reports use words like incident and friendly fire and regrettable. But the men who were there, who jumped from burning aircraft or watched from the ground as their friends' planes spiraled into the sea, do not use those words. They use Yarborough's word and they do not forget. The Mediterranean summer continues. The campaign for Sicily grinds on. But in planning rooms in Algiers and London and Washington, a new variable has entered the calculus of every future amphibious operation. The near certainty that, without a fundamental change in the way aircraft are visually identified, the next great invasion will produce the same catastrophe. The question is no longer whether the problem exists. 318 casualties have settled that question beyond argument. The question now is what to do about it. What mark, what signal, what visible declaration of identity can be placed on the skin of an airplane that will survive the chaos of combat and the limits of human perception and the speed of a decision made in terror? The answer is still taking shape, still working its way through committees and test flights and the bureaucratic machinery of a global alliance at war. But the need for it has been written in fire across the sky over Jegla, and the men who will carry it into battle, the pilots and crews and ground mechanics who will one day find themselves on darkened English airfields with buckets of paint and orders they do not yet understand, are already flying missions over Europe, unaware that a night in July over Sicily has set in motion the chain of events that will bring them, 11 months from now, to their hands and knees on the tarmac painting stripes. The dead of the 504th are buried in the American military cemetery at Agrigento, and later many are moved to the larger cemetery at Nettuno on the Italian coast. Their graves are marked with white crosses and stars of David, arrayed in the precise rows that the American Battle Monuments Commission maintains with meticulous care. The rows say nothing about how these men died. The rows do not distinguish between a paratrooper killed by a German bullet at a Sicilian crossroads and a paratrooper killed by an American shell fragment inside an American airplane over an American fleet. The symmetry of the rows implies that all deaths in war are alike. They are not. And the men who survive Sicily, the planners, the generals, the engineers, know they are not, and they carry that knowledge forward into the autumn and winter of 1943, into the planning for the next invasion, where the same problem waits like a trap that has already been sprung once and will spring again unless someone finds a way to change its mechanism. That next invasion is coming. It is Anzio, and it will teach the same lesson a second time in case anyone has been inclined to forget. The graves at Agrigento are barely settled when the first formal response begins to move through the institutional arteries of the Allied command. Vice Admiral H. Kent Hewitt, who commanded the Western Naval Task Force during Operation Husky, compiles his after-action report in the weeks following the invasion. Buried within it, among assessments of beach gradients and supply throughput, and the performance of landing craft in Sicilian surf, is a document designated Lesson Learned Number 42. The language is characteristically naval, measured, procedural, stripped of the anguish that produced it, but its implications are sweeping. It mandates improved coordination between air and surface forces, and, critically, it demands a system of identification markings that can be recognized visually, at distance, under combat conditions. The recommendation does not specify colors. It does not specify dimensions. It does not describe the precise geometry of the markings that will eventually emerge. What it does is establish, in the formal record of a 3-star admiral's operational assessment, that the existing methods of identifying friendly aircraft have failed catastrophically, and that the solution must involve something painted on the airplane itself, something large enough, conspicuous enough, unambiguous enough to survive the worst conditions that combat can produce. This is not a small bureaucratic step. In a coalition war fought across multiple theatres by air forces, navies and ground armies, that answer to different national commands. The simple act of mandating a marking on an aircraft touches logistics, supply, doctrine, training, and the sovereignty of every service branch that operates in the same airspace. A marking must be chosen that cannot be confused with any existing national insignia, that does not resemble any axis identification scheme, that is visible from below at combat altitude and from above against the patchwork of terrain, that can be applied quickly to thousands of aircraft without grounding them for extended maintenance periods, and that is agreed upon by British, American, Canadian, and eventually Free French air commanders whose institutional cultures differ in nearly every particular. The chain that connects Hewitt's recommendation to the stripes that will appear on the wings of fighters over Normandy is not a straight line. It is a branching, contentious, frequently stalled negotiation that takes place in planning rooms from Algiers to Norfolk House in London's St James's Square. At Allied Force Headquarters in the Mediterranean, AFHQ, the Joint Anglo-American Command that oversees all operations in the theatre, staff officers translate the recommendation into an initial operational solution. By late 1943, aircraft operating in the Mediterranean begin carrying broad yellow bands painted on their wings. The bands are crude, intentionally so. Visibility at distance requires width and contrast, not finesse. They are applied by maintenance crews using whatever paint is available, and they mark their bearers as friendly in the specific visual language that the disaster over Gila demanded. These yellow bands are not famous. They do not appear in the popular iconography of the war the way the black and white invasion stripes of Normandy will. But they are the direct ancestor of those stripes, the first operational proof that painted identification markings can function in a combat environment where electronic systems and silhouette recognition have already proved lethally inadequate. The concept migrates. Staff officers rotate between theatres. After-action reports circulate through the combined planning apparatus. And in England, where the machinery of a far larger invasion is beginning to assemble, the men responsible for air planning take note. They take note because they have no choice. The catastrophe over Sicily is not merely a Mediterranean problem. It is a preview of a problem that will recur at vastly greater scale over whatever beach the Allies choose for the liberation of France. The men who understand this most clearly are the men who have seen the reports, who have read the witness statements, who have tallied the dead. Among them is Major General Matthew B. Ridgway, who commanded the 82nd Airborne Division during Husky, and who watched the destruction of the 504th Air Fleet from the ground near Gila. Ridgway is not a man given to sentiment in official correspondence, but his reflection on the disaster carries a weight that transcends its measured syntax. "Deplorable as is the loss of life which occurred," he writes, "I believe that the lessons now learned could have been driven home in no other way." It is a sentence that acknowledges both the necessity and the obscenity of what happened, that 300 men had to die to teach a lesson that the institution could not learn any other way. It is the kind of sentence that only a commander who has buried his own men can write, and it carries within it both an indictment and a demand. This cannot happen again. The lesson must be applied. The markings must be standardized. The next invasion must not bury its own, and yet the next invasion does exactly that. On January 22, 1944, Allied forces land at Anzio and Nettuno on the Italian coast, 33 miles south of Rome. Operation Shingle is conceived as an amphibious end run around the stalled Gustav Line, a bold stroke that will place Allied troops behind the German defences and force a withdrawal. The landing itself achieves tactical surprise. The beachhead is established with minimal opposition, but the German response is swift and savage, and within days the Anzio perimeter becomes one of the most contested, compressed, and dangerous pieces of real estate in the European war. The beachhead is roughly 7 miles deep and 15 miles wide, a sliver of flat coastal ground overlooked by German-held hills, pounded by artillery and subjected to relentless air attack. Every ship in the harbour, every vehicle on the beach road, every man in a foxhole lives under the constant threat of German bombers sweeping in from the Alban Hills. And in this compressed, terrified, trigger-ready environment, the identification problem reasserts itself with vicious predictability. American 36 Apaches, the the dive-bombing variant of the P-51 Mustang, and P-40 Warhawks fly close air support over the beachhead, operating in a corridor so narrow that they are never far from the massed anti-aircraft batteries of the Allied fleet anchored offshore. The pilots approach their targets at low altitude, pulling out of dives within range of every gun on every ship in the anchorage. The naval gunners, conditioned by days of German air raids to fire at anything that moves fast and low, engage. The yellow identification bands adopted in the Mediterranean are present on some aircraft. They are not always visible, they are not always sufficient. The geometry of the problem, a fast-moving aircraft seen from below against an overcast sky, its markings obscured by angle or distance, or the simple fact that a gunner's eye is drawn to the silhouette before the colour, defeats the marking in case after case. American planes are hit by American ships, pilots are killed or wounded, aircraft limp back to their bases trailing smoke, their fuselages punctured by the same calibre of anti-aircraft round that is supposed to be directed at the Luftwaffe. The reports accumulate, they land on desks, they are filed, summarised, forwarded, acknowledged. And in most cases they produce the same institutional response that preceded them. A memorandum reiterating existing procedures, a reminder to gunners to verify targets before firing, a note in the operational log that the incident has been recorded and that measures are being taken. The language of institutional response is designed to absorb tragedy without permitting it to disrupt operations. The war does not pause for investigations. The beachhead does not stop fighting because a P-40 has been shot down by a destroyer. But one officer refuses to let the reports disappear into the filing system. Brigadier General Elwood Richard Quesada, Pete to everyone who knows him, commands the 9th Tactical Air Command, the fighter-bomber force that will provide close air support for American ground troops in the coming invasion of France. Quesada is 40 years old in the winter of 1944, compact, sharp-featured, possessed of an intensity that subordinates find either inspiring or exhausting depending on their proximity to it. He is not a desk general. He has flown combat missions himself, has insisted on understanding the tactical environment from the cockpit rather than the briefing room, and has built a reputation as one of the most innovative air commanders in the Army Air Forces. General Omar Bradley, who will command the American ground forces on D-Day, describes him as a brilliant, hard, and daring air support commander. And Bradley is not a man who distributes adjectives freely. Quesada's genius, if that is the right word for what he possesses, is organisational rather than strategic. He is a man who sees systems where others see incidents, where another officer might read a friendly fire report and see a regrettable accident, a gunner who panicked, a pilot who strayed off course, a communication breakdown in the heat of combat. Quesada reads the same report and sees a structural failure. He sees a system that is designed to produce exactly the outcome it is producing. The gunners are not incompetent. The pilots are not reckless. The communication officers are not negligent. The system itself, the combination of visual ambiguity, electronic inadequacy, compressed airspace, and the irreducible speed of human fear, is generating friendly fire incidents at a rate that is not accidental, but inevitable. The problem is not the people. The problem is the architecture of identification, and so Quesada begins to build a file. Not an official investigation. Those are the province of boards of inquiry and after-action review panels, but a private, meticulous collection of every friendly fire incident report he can obtain. He gathers them from squadron commanders, from naval liaison officers, from intelligence briefings, from the informal networks of communication that exist in every military organisation, alongside and beneath the formal channels. He assembles dates, locations, aircraft types, units involved, casualties sustained. He cross-references the incidents against weather conditions, time of day, the presence or absence of identification markings, the state of alert on the ships that fired. What emerges from this file is not a series of isolated tragedies. It is a pattern, a repeating, predictable, statistically demonstrable pattern of American forces destroying American aircraft, because the existing methods of identification are fundamentally inadequate for the conditions of modern amphibious warfare. Quesada views this pattern as an institutional scandal, not a scandal of malice. No one is deliberately shooting down friendly aircraft, but a scandal of inaction, of institutional inertia, of a command structure that has identified a lethal problem and has responded with memoranda instead of solutions. He is accumulating evidence for an argument he intends to make with the full force of his position and his personality, that the status quo is untenable, that half measures will not suffice, and that the identification gap must be closed before the next great amphibious operation, or the carnage of Sicily will repeat itself on a scale that dwarfs even the horror of that July night over Gela. The Anzio beachhead, in this sense, serves as Quesada's proving ground, not for a tactic, but for a thesis. Every incident report that enters his file is another data point confirming what the graves at Nettuno already testify, that the problem is not going away, that improved procedures and better communication and more rigorous training have not solved it, and that the only remaining solution is a visual one, a marking so large, so conspicuous, so unmistakable that it can override the fear and confusion and perceptual limitations that cause a gunner to fire on a friendly aircraft. The Mediterranean's yellow bands were a start. They were not enough. Whatever comes next must be bolder, more standardized, more universally applied. It must be, in effect, a uniform for aircraft, as instantly recognizable as the shape of a helmet or the color of a flag. Quesada carries this conviction with him as the center of gravity of the Allied war effort shifts northward, from the Mediterranean to England, from the beaches of Anzio to the planning rooms where Operation Overlord is taking shape. And the scale of what is taking shape in those planning rooms is almost beyond comprehension. By the spring of 1944, southern England has become the largest military staging area in human history. Airfields dot the landscape from Cornwall to Kent, permanent Royal Air Force stations, hastily constructed temporary strips, grass fields pressed into service with pierced steel planking laid over the turf. On these fields sit the aircraft of the United States 8th Air Force, the United States 9th Air Force, the Royal Air Force's Bomber Command and Fighter Command, the Royal Canadian Air Force, and contingents from a dozen other Allied nations. The numbers are staggering. The combined Allied air forces available for Overlord comprise more than 13,000 aircraft. On June 6th alone, a single day, the plan calls for approximately 14,674 individual sorties. Fighters, fighter bombers, medium bombers, heavy bombers, transport aircraft, glider tugs, reconnaissance planes, air-sea rescue craft. All of them will be airborne over the same narrow corridor of the English Channel and the same stretch of Norman coastline within the same hours. The corridor itself is the problem. The English Channel at its narrowest is barely 21 miles wide. The invasion beaches span roughly 50 miles of the Normandy coast. The air traffic over this rectangle of sea and sand will be denser than anything ever attempted in the history of aviation, military or civilian. And beneath those aircraft, filling that same corridor, will be roughly 5,000 ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, landing craft, transports, minesweepers, an armada that stretches from horizon to horizon, every vessel manned by gunners who have been briefed on one paramount threat: German air attack. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, is not destroyed. Allied intelligence estimates that the Germans can put several hundred fighters and bombers into the air over the beachhead within hours of the landing. The naval gunners know this. They have been told to expect it. They have been trained to engage fast-moving, low-flying aircraft. They are prepared to fire. This is the geometry that keeps Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory awake in the spring of 1944. Leigh-Mallory commands the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, the overall air component of Overlord, and the friendly fire problem falls squarely within his authority and his nightmares. He is a controversial figure, cautious by temperament, frequently at odds with the American air commanders, a man whose pessimistic risk assessments have earned him both respect for his honesty and frustration for his reluctance. But on this particular issue, his caution is prophetic rather than obstructive. Leigh-Mallory's staff begins modelling the friendly fire risk for D-Day, running the numbers through the calculus of probability and geometry and human error. How many aircraft will be within range of naval anti-aircraft batteries at any given moment? How many seconds does a gunner have to identify a target? What is the statistical likelihood that a P-47 Thunderbolt, approaching at 300 miles per hour from the direction of the enemy coast, will be misidentified as a Focke-Wulf 190 by a gunner who has been under air attack for the past 6 hours? The numbers come back and they are devastating. The planning documents do not use the word catastrophe. They use a more clinical term. The projected friendly fire losses are assessed as unacceptable. In the vocabulary of military planning, unacceptable is not a word of moral judgment. It is a word of operational mathematics. It means that the projected losses will degrade the effectiveness of the air support mission to the point where the mission itself may fail. It means that the fighters that are supposed to protect the beachhead from the Luftwaffe will be so depleted by friendly fire that the Luftwaffe will have a freer hand than it should. It means that the transports carrying the airborne divisions will fly through the same gauntlet that the 504th flew through over Gela, but at 10 times the scale. It means, in the bluntest possible terms, that Overlord's own air forces may be crippled by Overlord's own navy before the first German fighter arrives. The scale compounds every weakness. The IFF systems, identification, friend or foe, the electronic transponders carried by Allied aircraft, are designed for a battlefield with dozens or perhaps hundreds of aircraft in a given sector. They are not designed for a sky containing thousands. At the densities projected for D-Day, the IFF returns will merge into an unreadable clutter on the radar screens of the naval vessels below. The operators will see a solid mass of blips. They will not be able to distinguish a flight of P-51 Mustangs from a formation of Junkers 88s. The electronic solution, the technological answer that was supposed to make visual identification unnecessary, will be saturated into uselessness by the sheer volume of the operation it is meant to support. Silhouette recognition, the art of identifying an aircraft by its shape, faces equally impossible odds. A gunner on a destroyer in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, exhausted, soaked with spray, deafened by the bombardment, watching a shape hurtle toward him out of the overcast at 300 miles per hour, does not have the luxury of consulting a recognition chart. He has fractions of a second, and in those fractions of a second, the twin-tailed silhouette of a P-38 Lightning can look very much like a Messerschmitt 110. The blunt nose of a P-47 can look very much like a Focke-Wulf 190. The sleek profile of a P-51 can look very much like a Messerschmitt 109. These are the same identification failures that killed men over Sicily. They are the same failures that killed men over Anzio, and they will kill men over Normandy unless something changes. Lee Mallory's planning staff arrives at this conclusion with the grim certainty of people who have done the arithmetic and found no comfort in the result. The existing identification methods, IFF, silhouette recognition, pre-planned flight corridors, time on target deconfliction, are necessary but not sufficient. Even in combination, they will not prevent friendly fire losses at the densities projected for D-Day. Something else is needed, something visual, something that works at the speed of perception rather than the speed of cognition, something that a terrified gunner can register in the fragment of a second before his finger tightens on the trigger. The answer, when it comes, will be paint. Black and white paint, applied in broad alternating bands around the wings and fuselages of every Allied aircraft that will fly over the invasion corridor. The answer will be crude, inelegant, and applied with brooms and mops by men who have never held a paintbrush in their lives. But the answer has its origins here, in these spring planning sessions in England, in the incident reports from Anzio that Quesada carries like an indictment, in the yellow bands of the Mediterranean that prove the concept but not the execution, in the graves at Nettuno where the men of the 504th lie in rows that reveal nothing of how they died. The stripes are coming, but they have not yet been chosen, not yet been specified, not yet been ordered. The problem has been stated, the scale has been measured, the mathematics have been run. What remains is the decision, the precise specification of width and colour and placement, and then the far more daunting challenge of applying that decision to more than 11,000 aircraft, in a window of time so narrow that it seems, to the men who will have to execute it, physically impossible. That challenge still lies ahead, coiled in the logistics of paint supply and airfield capacity, and the ticking clock of an invasion date that the weather and the tides have already fixed within a margin of days. In the planning rooms of southern England, the charts on the wall show the beaches of Normandy, and the arrows on the charts show the flight paths of the aircraft that will cover the landings, and the red penciled notes in the margins show the projected attrition from friendly fire. And the men who read those notes understand that the solution, whatever form it takes, cannot be partial. It must cover every aircraft, every fighter, every bomber, every transport, every glider tug. It must be unmistakable at distance, unambiguous in silhouette, visible in dawn light and full daylight, and the murky half-darkness of an overcast Channel morning. And it must be applied in secret, because any marking visible enough to save Allied pilots from Allied gunners is also visible enough to tell German intelligence that the invasion is imminent. The problem, in its fullness, is now defined. The solution waits to be born. It is born in a committee room, not on a battlefield, not in the cockpit of a fighter plane, but in the prosaic fluorescent-lit confines of a staff meeting, where officers from multiple commands sit around a table covered in recognition silhouettes, paint swatches, and photographs of aircraft taken at various distances and angles. The spring of 1944 brings with it a cascade of planning sessions, and in one of those sessions, convened under the authority of Lee Mallory's Allied Expeditionary Air Force headquarters, the question that has haunted Allied operations since Sicily is finally given a concrete answer. The debate, as it unfolds across weeks of meetings, centres on a deceptively simple question. What does a universal friendly identification marking look like? The word universal is doing enormous work in that sentence. A marking that functions only from directly below is useless to a naval gunner who sees an aircraft in profile. A marking visible only from the side is invisible to a soldier lying on his back in a foxhole watching the sky. A marking that works in clear weather but vanishes against cloud cover is worthless over the English Channel in June. Whatever the planners choose must function from every angle, at every altitude, in every light condition that the invasion might present. And it must do so instantly, not after a moment's study, but in the first flash of recognition, the way a red traffic light communicates its meaning before the conscious mind has finished processing the colour. The alternatives are surprisingly numerous. Staff officers from SHAEF, from the 8th and 9th Air Forces, and from the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force each bring proposals. Coloured wingtips, red, yellow, bright blue, are discussed and dismissed. A single colour can be confused with existing national markings, or with the coloured noses and tails that individual fighter groups already use for unit identification. Geometric shapes, circles, triangles, large chevrons painted on the undersides of wings, are considered and set aside. A shape requires the observer to process its geometry, to distinguish a circle from the roundel that already sits on every RAF aircraft, to read a triangle in the half-second before firing. Geometric shapes demand cognition. What is needed is something that bypasses cognition entirely and strikes the eye the way a barber's pole strikes the eye, through sheer contrast and repetition. Radio signals naturally are revisited and just as naturally rejected. IFF has failed repeatedly under combat conditions. The transponders are unreliable, the frequencies are saturated, the equipment aboard ships and in ground batteries is inconsistent. Radio is part of the solution, but it cannot be the solution. The Gila disaster proved that with finality. What emerges, through the iterative logic of elimination, is the simplest possible answer. Stripes. Not one stripe, not a single band of colour, but multiple alternating bands of the two highest contrast colours available, black and white. The reasoning is almost brutally straightforward. No natural feature of any existing aircraft, Allied or Axis, presents alternating black and white bands. The Luftwaffe uses crosses, swastikas and various unit-specific markings, but nothing that resembles a barber pole pattern of repeating bands. The RAF roundel is a concentric circle. The American star and bar is a geometric emblem. The proposed stripes are neither geometric nor symbolic. They are a raw visual signal, a pattern that exists solely to be noticed. They carry no information other than the single message that matters: this aircraft is ours. 5 bands are specified, 3 white, 2 black, alternating so that a white band sits at each edge and in the centre, with a black band between each pair of white. For single-engine aircraft, the P-47s, the P-51s, the Spitfires, the Typhoons, each band is 18 inches wide. For twin-engine aircraft, the P-38s, the Mosquitoes, the Marauders, the Mitchells, 24 inches, scaled to remain visible on the larger airframes. The bands wrap fully around the rear fuselage, aft of the national insignia, and extend across both wings, upper and lower surfaces alike. The effect, when viewed from any angle, is unmistakable. An aircraft carrying these bands cannot be confused with any German type. The pattern screams identification, in a language that requires no translation, no training, no recognition chart. On May 17, 1944, Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory formally approves the marking scheme. His signature carries the authority of the entire Allied Expeditionary Air Force. The decision flows downward through the chain of command, to the headquarters of the 8th Air Force, to Major General Louis Brereton's 9th Air Force, to the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force, to the troop carrier groups whose C-47s will once again carry paratroopers into the night sky over hostile territory. Brereton, who commands the tactical units that will fly closest to the beaches and therefore face the greatest risk of friendly fire, oversees the implementation and planning for his squadrons. He understands, as do all the senior commanders, that the stripes are not a nicety. They are a survival mechanism. They are the answer to the question that the Graves at Nettuno have been asking for 11 months. But approval is not implementation. And between the signature on May 17th and the first brushstroke on an aircraft wing lies a gap that is not measured in weeks, but in the most corrosive substance known to military planning: secrecy. The paradox is exquisite and terrible. The invasion stripes are designed to be the most visible marking ever applied to military aircraft. 5 bands, 18 inches wide each, wrapped around wings and fuselages. They are meant to be seen from miles away by nervous gunners squinting through gun sights. And yet, until the moment the invasion begins, they must not be seen at all. Because a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot, and they are still flying, still probing, still photographing English airfields from high altitude whenever the weather and the RAF's fighter screen permit. A single Luftwaffe pilot spotting a field full of freshly striped aircraft would know, instantly and unmistakably, that the invasion is imminent. The stripes would become their own betrayal. The marking designed to save Allied lives would, if applied too early, compromise the single most closely guarded secret of the war: the date of the cross-channel assault. This is the constraint that shapes everything that follows. Leigh-Mallory's headquarters has approved the stripes in mid-May. The paint, enormous quantities of government-issue whitewash and flat black, can be quietly stockpiled at airfields across southern and eastern England under the cover of routine maintenance supply. The specifications can be drawn up, printed and held in sealed envelopes. But the order to paint cannot go out until the invasion is so close that even if the Luftwaffe spots the markings, there is no longer time for the Germans to react. The window, when the planners calculate it, is agonizingly narrow. The stripes must go on after the last possible moment of compromise and before the first possible moment of combat. In practice, this means hours, not days. Hours. The communications chain that will carry the order is plotted with the precision of a bombing mission. From Leigh-Mallory's AEAF headquarters, the directive will pass simultaneously to the subordinate Air Force commands, to the 8th, to the 9th, to the RAF formations. From the Air Force commands, it will flow to group headquarters. From group headquarters to station commanders. From station commanders to the crew chiefs and maintenance officers who will actually execute the painting. Each link in this chain represents a telephone call, a teleprinter message, a motorcycle dispatch rider on a blacked-out English road. Each link represents time consumed, and time is the commodity in shortest supply. The decision is made to stagger the order. Troop carrier units, the C-47 groups whose aircraft are the largest, slowest and most vulnerable, and whose crews carry the memory of Gila like scar tissue, will receive the directive on the evening of June 3rd. Fighter and bomber squadrons will receive it on June 4th. This staggering serves two purposes. It spreads the logistical burden across 2 nights rather than one, and it reflects operational reality. The troop carriers will fly first, in the pre-dawn darkness of June 6th, dropping paratroopers hours before the beach landings begin. They need their stripes earliest. The fighters and bombers, which will fly in the growing light of morning, can afford a few additional hours. June 3rd, 1944. The original D-Day, June 5th, is still the target as the afternoon wears on, though the weather over the Channel is deteriorating and Eisenhower's meteorologists are growing increasingly uneasy. At airfields across England, the day proceeds with the strange normalcy of a coiled spring. Aircraft are serviced, ammunition is loaded, pilots attend routine briefings that carefully avoid mentioning dates or targets. The sealed envelopes sit in station commanders' safes. The paint sits in supply buildings stacked in drums and cans that no one has been authorized to open. And then, as evening falls, the teleprinters begin to chatter. The order arrives at the troop carrier bases first as planned. Within the hour it cascades outward to the fighter and bomber fields. Station commanders open their sealed instructions. The specifications are precise. 5 bands, 3 white, 2 black, alternating. 18 inches wide for single-engine types. 24 for twins. Fuselage and both wings. Paint to be applied using whatever materials are available. The order does not specify professional-grade equipment, because professional-grade equipment does not exist in sufficient quantity. What exists is whitewash, flat black paint, rollers from the base supply depot, and whatever brushes, brooms and mops can be requisitioned, borrowed, or improvised. At RAF Leiston, on the Suffolk coast, the 357th Fighter Group receives the word. Leiston is a typical wartime English airfield, a cluster of Nissen huts and dispersal pens spread across flat farmland, connected by narrow taxiways, surrounded by hedgerows. The field holds 70-odd P-51 Mustangs, sleek and silver-skinned, dispersed in revetments around the perimeter to minimize the damage from any German air attack. On this evening the overcast is low and the air smells of damp grass and the permanent undertone of aviation fuel that permeates every operational airfield in England. A light rain is falling. It will continue off and on through the night. The order comes down from the group commander to the squadron commanders to the maintenance officers, and from the maintenance officers it radiates outward like a shockwave through the enlisted ranks. Every available man is needed, not just the crew chiefs who know their individual aircraft the way a rider knows a horse, not just the armourers and the engine mechanics, everyone. Fuel handlers, radio technicians, cooks, clerks, men whose only connection to aircraft maintenance is that they live on an airfield. They are roused from evening meals, from letter writing, from the small rituals of an English evening in early June. They are handed brushes. They are handed rollers. They are pointed toward the dispersal pens where the Mustangs sit in the thickening dusk, and they are told to paint. The scene that unfolds at Leiston over the next hours is replicated, with local variations, at dozens of airfields across England. It is replicated at Boxted, in Essex, where the 56th Fighter Group's Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, the massive jug-shaped fighters that outweigh a Mustang by nearly 3,000 pounds, present even more surface area to be covered. It is replicated at Bottisham and Wormingford, and Steeple Morden, and Raiden and Duxford and Foulmere. Wherever Allied fighters sit on English soil, men are painting. At Leiston, the work proceeds under conditions that might generously be described as field expedient. The blackout is in force. The base lighting regulations that have governed every English military installation since 1939 remain absolute. No floodlights, no arc lamps. A flashlight, hooded and pointed downward, is the most illumination anyone dares. Some men hold the flashlight while others paint. Some paint by touch, running their fingers along the trailing edge of a wing to find where the last band ends and the next must begin. The rain complicates everything. The whitewash, which is water-soluble, does not adhere well to wet aluminum. It runs, it streaks, it thins out and shows the bare metal beneath. Men lay it on thick, go back, lay it on again. The black paint is somewhat more cooperative, but it too struggles against the moisture that films every surface. Hands grow cold and stiff. The metal skin of a P-51 wing, slicked with rain, is unforgiving to kneel on. There is no masking tape. The edges of the bands, which the specifications call for at 18 inches, are eyeballed, estimated, measured by hand span or by the length of a forearm. A crew chief might mark the boundaries with a grease pencil if he has one, or with a chalked string if he can find chalk, or simply by pointing and saying "about there." The result is bands that are approximately 18 inches wide, some narrower, some wider, some that wander slightly as they traverse the curve of a fuselage. The lines between black and white are not crisp. They are blurred, feathered, occasionally overlapping. In places the white streaks into the black. In places the black bleeds beyond its intended boundary. The overall effect, when seen at arm's length, is unmistakably what it is supposed to be, alternating bands of high contrast, but it carries none of the precision of a factory finish. It looks like what it is, a marking applied by hand, in the dark, in the rain, by men working against a deadline they do not fully understand, and that is the other dimension of this night. The men painting do not know the date of the invasion. They have not been briefed. They have not been told that the channel crossing is imminent, or that the beaches have been selected, or that 156,000 men are poised to embark. They know only what the urgency tells them, and the urgency tells them everything. When a station commander pulls every available body out of bed and hands them paintbrushes, when armed guards appear at the perimeter gates and the base is sealed, when officers who normally spend their evenings in the club are out on the tarmac in coveralls with whitewash in their hair, the men understand. They cannot say it aloud, they cannot write it in letters home, but they know. The invasion is close. This night's work is part of it. And if they do not fully grasp why black and white stripes on an airplane wing might matter, they grasp the tone in their crew chief's voice when he says to do it right, to make the bands thick and clean and visible, because lives are going to depend on it. The smell of wet paint mingles with the smell of high-octane aviation fuel, and the flat green scent of English rain on English grass. Somewhere across the field, a wrench clangs against concrete. A muffled voice curses. The night is long and cold and damp, and there are still 40 aircraft to finish before morning. At other bases, the scenes carry their own particular textures. At Boxstead, the crew chiefs of the 56th Fighter Group face the additional challenge of the P-47's enormous dimensions. Its fuselage is broader, its wings thicker, and the surface area demanding paint is substantially greater than that of a Mustang. The big thunderbolts sit in their dispersals like patient draft horses, and the men clamber over them with ladders and step ladders, and in some cases simply boost each other up to reach the upper wing surfaces. The bands on a P-47's fuselage wrap around a circumference that demands 2 men working in coordination, one on each side trying to keep the bands aligned where they meet at the belly and the spine of the aircraft. Alignment is approximate. The result is functional, not beautiful. The rain lets up around midnight at some fields and returns before dawn. At others, it persists through the small hours as a steady soaking mist that clings to every surface and turns the tarmac into a mirror reflecting the faintest light. Men work through it. They have no choice. The order carries no provision for weather delays, no fallback schedule. The stripes must be on the aircraft before the aircraft fly. The aircraft will fly when the invasion begins, and the invasion, as every man on every sealed airfield in England can feel in his bones, is a matter of days at most. By the grey hours before dawn on June 4th, the work at Leiston is largely complete. Captain Bud Anderson, a pilot of the 357th Fighter Group, walks out to the dispersal area to find his P-51, the aircraft he has named Old Crow. What he sees stops him. The Mustang that yesterday was a clean, silver-skinned fighter is now banded with broad stripes of white and black, wrapped around the fuselage aft of the cockpit and extending across both wings. The bands are rough, the edges are imprecise. The whitewash has a chalky matte quality that contrasts starkly with the aircraft's aluminum skin. Anderson stares. The stripes are enormous, far larger than he had imagined from the verbal description alone. They dominate the aircraft's appearance, transforming its silhouette from that of a sleek combat fighter into something that looks almost circus-like. I couldn't believe how big they were, he will later recall, but the stripes are there, and they are unmistakable. From 100 yards, from 500, from 1,000, there is no confusing this aircraft with anything in the Luftwaffe's inventory. The pattern is unique, bold, almost aggressive in its visibility. It sacrifices every principle of camouflage in service of a single imperative: recognition. This aircraft is allied. Do not fire. Across the airfields of England, as the morning of June 4th breaks damp and grey, the same transformation reveals itself. Thousands of aircraft, P-47s, P-51s, P-38s, Spitfires, Typhoons, Mosquitoes, B-26 Marauders, C-47 transports, sit on their hard stands wearing the crude but unmistakable livery of the invasion. The paint is sloppy. The bands are imperfect. In places the rain has thinned the whitewash to a translucent wash, through which the underlying paint shows like a ghost. In other places the black has been laid on so thick it has run in streaks down the curve of a fuselage. None of it matters. What matters is that the pattern is there, consistent, repeated on every aircraft, visible from every angle, instantly recognizable to any observer, to a naval gunner squinting through binoculars from the bridge of a destroyer, to an infantryman lying in a hedgerow looking up at the sky, to another pilot approaching head-on at a closing speed of 600 miles per hour. On this morning, Eisenhower postpones the invasion by 24 hours. The weather has won a brief reprieve. D-Day will be June 6th, not June 5th. The stripes, already painted, will have to survive another day of English weather, another cycle of rain and damp and the slow dissolution of whitewash exposed to moisture. Ground crews touch up the worst spots, reapply where the rain has washed the white bands thin. The black holds better. The white is the constant concern. But the stripes endure. They cling to the aluminum skins of 11,000 aircraft with the tenacity of an idea that has travelled from the burning sky over Gila to the committee rooms of London, to the rain-slicked tarmac of Leiston and Boxstead and 100 other fields. They are imperfect. They are ugly. They are the most important paint job in the history of aerial warfare. And in the briefing rooms that are beginning to fill with pilots and navigators and bombardiers, the maps on the walls are being uncovered for the first time, and the men who will fly these freshly striped aircraft are about to learn where they are going. Consider the stripes as objects now, in the pause the weather has granted. For 24 hours they are simply there, drying, waiting, exposed. Study one of them up close, the way a crew chief does on the morning of June 4th as he crouches beside a wing with a rag and a bucket, examining his own night's work in the flat grey light. The band is not a band at all in the way a factory marking would be a band, not a clean geometric shape laid down by machine, its edges snapped tight against a strip of tape. It is a thing made by a hand holding a broom. You can read the hand in it. Where the bristles were fully loaded with whitewash, the white lies thick and opaque. Where the load thinned, near the end of a stroke, the white goes translucent and the silver aluminum goes through it. The edges do not run straight. They waver where the man's arm wavered, where the curve of the fuselage forced him to reach, where the wind gusted and jogged his shoulder. In one place the white has bled sideways into the black, a smear of grey at the boundary where the two paints met before either had set. In another the black was laid on heavy and ran downward under its own weight, leaving a thin dark tongue that dried mid-drip along the belly of the aircraft. This is what haste looks like when it dries. This is what it means that no one had masking tape, that the order came too late to do the thing properly, that the paint went on in the dark and the rain by men who had never painted an airplane in their lives and would never paint one again. And it is precisely this quality, this unmistakable evidence of the human hand, that will matter more than anyone in those planning rooms in London could have known. A factory marking can be counterfeited. A clean geometric pattern can be reproduced by a clever enemy with a paint shop and a photograph. But this ragged, streaked, hand-laid mess, this pattern that no two aircraft wear in exactly the same way, that varies from one crew chief to the next, from one field to the next, from one weary man's technique to another's, this reads instantly and viscerally as something thrown on in a hurry by one's own side. It is organic. It is human. It carries in its very imperfection the signature of the vast improvised effort that produced it. No German aircraft over Normandy will wear anything like it, and no German paint shop working from a reconnaissance photograph could hope to reproduce the specific chaos of 11,000 hand-painted variations applied overnight across 100 English fields. And so the imperfection is not a flaw in the system. The imperfection is the system. The sloppiness that the crew chiefs cursed as they worked, the streaks and runs and thin patches that offended every instinct of men who took pride in the appearance of their machines, all of it, in the end, is part of what makes the marking impossible to fake and impossible to mistake. The stripe works not despite being ugly, but partly because it is ugly, because ugliness of this particular kind can only come from urgency. An urgency of this particular kind can only come from an army preparing to throw itself across a sea. The rain returns intermittently through June 4th and into June 5th. It is not the driving downpour of the first night, but a persistent English drizzle, a dampness that hangs in the air and settles on everything, that beads on the canopies and pools in the wing roots and keeps the whitewash from ever fully curing. The white bands are the constant worry. Whitewash is not a durable paint. It is chalk and water and a binder, chosen for speed and availability rather than permanence, and it does not love moisture. Where the rain runs across it, it thins. Where a boot scuffs it during a maintenance check, it smears. Crew chiefs walk the flight lines with buckets and rags, touching up the worst of it, laying a second coat over the bands that have washed too thin, watching the sky and the paint with equal anxiety. The black holds. The black always holds. It is the white that requires vigilance, the white that must remain white and opaque and bold if the whole scheme is to function, because it is the contrast between the two, the sharp alternation of light and dark, that catches the eye of a gunner at distance, that resolves into an unmistakable pattern where a single colour would blur into grey. For a day and a night, then, the aircraft sit. They sit at Leiston and at Boxted, at Debden and at Bodney and at Steeple Morden, and at 100 fields whose names most of the men who flew from them would carry for the rest of their lives. They sit under the drizzle with their new stripes drying slowly in the damp, tethered to the earth by weather, while, out in the ports and the assembly areas, the greatest amphibious force ever gathered strains against its own delay. The pilots wait too. They have been briefed to expect the invasion, and then briefed that it would not come, not yet, and the waiting has its own texture. The enforced idleness of men who have been keyed to a razor's edge and then told to stand down for a day. Some sleep, some cannot. Some walk out to the dispersals in the grey afternoon to look again at their striped aircraft, to study the transformation, to try to make peace with what these markings mean. Because the pilots understand, in a way the ground crews perhaps do not yet fully grasp, what the stripes are for. The ground crews painted them. The pilots will have to trust them. And then, on the evening of June 5th, 1944, the maps come down from behind their curtains for the last time, and the waiting ends. The briefing rooms of the 8th and 9th Air Force fighter groups fill in the failing light of that Monday evening. They are ordinary rooms, Nissen huts with curved corrugated roofs, plank benches, a stage at one end, a wall hung with maps kept covered until this moment. The pilots file in, and there is in the room the particular quiet of men who know that this is it, that the thing they have trained for and dreaded and half longed for has finally arrived. The intelligence officer pulls the curtain, and there is the coast of Normandy, and there are the beaches, and there are the assembly areas and the routes and the times, and the whole enormity of Operation Overlord resolves on the wall in front of them in acetate and grease pencil. Much of the briefing is what they expect: targets, timing, weather, the disposition of enemy forces, the areas where the Luftwaffe might appear, the coordination with the bombers and the transports and the ground forces coming ashore. But woven through all of it, repeated and emphasized and hammered home, is the matter of the stripes. And here the tone of the briefing changes, because here the officers are not describing a mission, but issuing a warning that concerns the pilot's own survival at the hands of their own side. The message is absolute, and it is delivered without softening. Below the beaches, in the channel, lies the invasion fleet, more than 5,000 ships, every one of them bristling with anti-aircraft guns, every gunner among them primed by rumour and briefing, and the memory of Luftwaffe attacks to expect enemy aircraft over the beachhead. Those gunners have been told about the stripes. The Navy has been briefed. Every ship in the Armada has received the word: Allied aircraft will wear 5 alternating bands of black and white on their fuselages and wings. Any aircraft displaying that pattern is friendly and is not to be engaged. And the corollary, spoken plainly in the briefing room so that no man can misunderstand it: any aircraft that does not display the stripes may be considered hostile. Any aircraft without the stripes may be fired upon. Do not fly without them. The instruction lands in the room with the weight of a death sentence deferred. The pilots understand what they are being told. Their lives, over the beachhead, will depend not on their airmanship, not on the speed of their Mustangs and Thunderbolts, not on the skill they have honed over months of combat, but on paint. On whitewash and lamp black applied by exhausted men in the dark 2 nights ago, imperfect and streaked and thin in places, drying still in the damp. If the stripes hold, if they read at distance, if the gunners below recognize them for what they are, then the pilots will survive their own fleet. If the stripes fail, if they have washed too thin, if a nervous gunner does not see them or does not trust them or fires first and looks afterward, then the men in those cockpits will die exactly as the paratroopers of the 504th died over Gila, torn out of the sky by their own side, and the whole apparatus of the invasion stripes will have failed in the one moment it was created to master. At Boxted, the men of the 56th Fighter Group received this word. The 56th is a legend already, the Wolfpack, flying the massive P-47 Thunderbolt, and its story is bound up with the man who built it. Colonel Hubert Zemke, Hub Zemke to the men who fly under him, is one of the finest fighter leaders the American Air Forces have produced, a hard, exacting tactician who has forged the 56th into one of the most lethal fighter groups in the theatre. Zemke and the officers under him carry the burden of the identification protocol as a matter of command responsibility. It is not enough that the stripes are painted. Every pilot in the group must understand the protocol, must grasp that the fleet below them is a threat as real as any Fokker-Wulf, must fly the mission in the knowledge that the paint on their wings is the only thing standing between them and their own destroyers' guns. The gravity of it settles over the briefing. These are men who have faced the Luftwaffe over Germany, who have watched friends fall to enemy fire, and now they are being told that on this morning the greater danger may come from below, from their own ships, and that their protection against it is a hand-painted marking laid on in the rain. The same message moves through the 9th Air Force groups, the tactical fighters who will work lowest and closest to the beaches, strafing and bombing and flying armed reconnaissance over the ground battle. Among the men whose names would come to stand for that period is Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, a fighter leader of formidable aggressiveness and skill, the kind of officer whose command presence in a briefing room carries the authority of a man who has repeatedly proven himself in the air. For leaders like Meyer, the June 5th briefing is a test of communication as much as anything. The need to impress upon young pilots, some of them very young, some of them flying their first combat missions, that the ordinary rules of survival have been altered, that the sky over Normandy will be more crowded and more dangerous than any they have seen, and that discipline about the stripes is not bureaucratic fussiness, but the thin margin of their own lives. For the pilots hearing it, the psychological weight is peculiar and heavy. A fighter pilot's entire training is built around trust in his machine and his own skill. He's taught to control his fate through speed, altitude, aggression, and cunning. But the stripes strip a portion of that control away and place it in the hands of others, in the hands of the crew chiefs who painted them, in the hands of the naval gunners who must recognize them, in the hands of a system of recognition and briefing and discipline that stretches from the deck of a destroyer to the cockpit of a thunderbolt. The pilot can fly perfectly and still be shot down if the paint fails or the gunner errs. There is no maneuver against a friendly shell fired in error. There is only the paint and the hope that it will do its work. The briefings end. The pilots file back out into the June evening, into the last of the light and the gathering dark, and they carry with them the knowledge of where they're going and what will keep them alive when they get there. Some try to sleep in the short hours available, some write letters, some walk out one last time to look at their aircraft, to see the stripes in the dusk, to consider that these crude bands of black and white are now the most important thing about their machines. Overhead, through the broken cloud, the weather is beginning to turn. The storm that forced the postponement is easing into the narrow window the meteorologists have identified, the gap in the weather that Eisenhower has staked the invasion upon. Out in the darkness beyond the fields, the ships are already moving, the vast fleet flowing out of the ports and the assembly areas toward the rendezvous point south of the Isle of Wight, toward the swept channels through the minefields toward France. And in the small hours of June 6th, on the darkened airfields of England, the pilots go to their aircraft. It is still full dark when the first fighters lift off. The pre-dawn of June 6th, 1944 is a thing of engine noise and blue exhaust flame, and the smell of high-octane fuel and cold English grass. The P-47s of the 8th Air Force groups, the P-51s of Leiston and Debden and Steeple Morden, the P-38s with their twin booms and their broader stripes, the tactical fighters of the 9th, all of them roll out onto the runways in the blackness and claw into the air, forming up by the flare of navigation lights and the discipline of long practice, wheeling out over the coast and pointing their noses south toward the Channel and the invasion. They cross in the grey of first light, in the hours between 4 and 7 in the morning, when the world is neither night nor day, when the sea below is a sheet of pewter, and the sky above is streaked with the coming dawn. Many of them fly low. Armed reconnaissance and ground attack missions demand it, and the low altitude keeps them out of the paths of the bombers and the transports layered above. They fly out over water that is empty at first, cold and grey and featureless, and then the water is not empty. Beneath them, filling the Channel from horizon to horizon, is the fleet. There is nothing in the experience of any of these men that has prepared them for the sight of it. More than 5,000 ships, battleships and cruisers and destroyers, transports and landing craft, minesweepers and tugs and vessels of a dozen kinds, ranked and columned across the sea in numbers that defy the eye's ability to count, their wakes cutting the pewter water into a vast white lattice, all of it flowing steadily south toward the coast of France. From 1,000 feet, from 500, from the low altitudes at which the fighters skim the water, the Armada is not a collection of ships but a single organism, a mass of steel and men so enormous that it seems to reorder the sea itself. Pilots who have flown over Germany, who have seen flak barrages and burning cities and the massed formations of the bomber stream, will speak for the rest of their lives of the moment they crossed the Channel on the morning of June 6th and looked down and understood what was happening below them. And understanding it, they understand something else viscerally in the pit of the stomach. that every one of those 5,000 ships carries guns, and that those guns are pointed at the sky, and that the men behind them have been awake all night crossing a mined and hostile sea toward an enemy coast, that they are frightened and exhausted and primed to fire, that they have been told the Luftwaffe will come. To those gunners looking up from the decks into the uncertain light, an aircraft is a shape against the sky, a silhouette to be identified in the half-second before decision, friend or enemy, hold or fire. The gunners cannot hear the engines over their own. They cannot read the markings on a distant fuselage. They can see only the pattern, the gross visual signature, the thing that resolves at distance into recognition or does not. The stripes are the only introduction the pilots have. There is no time for anything else. No radio handshake will carry to 5,000 ships. No IFF signal will read clearly through the saturation of the airspace, where thousands of Allied aircraft are transmitting at once, and the whole scheme of electronic identification has broken down under sheer numbers exactly as the planners feared. There is only the paint, the ragged, streaked, hand-laid bands of black and white wrapped around each fuselage and wing, applied in the dark and the rain 2 nights ago, dried in the damp through a day of postponement, touched up by anxious crew chiefs at the last light of June 5th. As each fighter passes over the fleet, as each pilot looks down at the guns and understands that those guns could open on him in an instant, the entire weight of his survival rests on whether the gunner below him sees the stripes and reads them true. This is the moment the whole 11-month effort has been building toward. From the burning sky over Jailer, from the after-action reports and the boards of inquiry, from lesson learned number 42, and the crude yellow wing bands of the Mediterranean, from Ansio's cruel repetition of the same lesson, from the committee rooms of London and Lee Mallory's approval, and the buckets and brooms of the last-minute night, all of it has come down to this. To fighter pilots crossing the Channel at first light, looking down at the largest fleet in human history, wearing paint applied by hand in the rain, testing in a single morning whether an idea can hold up against the terror and exhaustion and trigger fingers of 5,000 ships worth of frightened men. The gunners look up, the pilots look down, and in the grey light between them, the stripes must do their work. For the pilots, there's nothing to do now but fly, and trust, and hold their courses over the fleet, and watch the guns below with a wariness they would never have imagined feeling toward their own navy. Some of them will remember the crossing as strangely quiet, the fleet passing beneath them without incident, the stripes doing exactly what they were made to do. The pattern reads, the gunners hold. Aircraft after aircraft crosses the armada and passes on toward the beaches unfired upon, the great chain of recognition holding link by link, ship by ship, plane by plane, across the whole width of the Channel in the growing light of the longest day. But the test is not over. The Channel crossing is only the first passage over friendly guns, and the beachhead ahead holds thousands more. The guns of the ships closest to shore, the guns of the landing craft, and soon the guns of the men fighting their way up the sand and into the hedgerows beyond, all of them looking up into a sky more crowded with aircraft than any battlefield in history has ever been. The stripes have survived the crossing. Whether they will survive the chaos of the beachhead itself, whether they will hold through the long day and the confusion and the fog of the greatest battle yet fought in the West, that is still to be determined in the hours after first light, over the sand and the surf of Normandy. Over the beaches, the sky is not the clean formation of a training exercise. It is a churn. Fighters weave at altitude, watching for the Luftwaffe that never comes in the numbers anyone feared. Bombers thread their runs through the flak. Below them, the shoreline is a smear of smoke and fire, and the black shapes of landing craft grinding toward the sand. And behind those, the great grey wall of the fleet, every ship of it bristling with barrels tilted upward at a sky it does not entirely trust. This is where the stripes will earn their keep or fail. This is the passage the whole scheme was designed for. Not the open channel, where distance and altitude gave a gunner a moment to look twice, but the tight, panicked air over the beachhead, where a plane comes in low and fast and a frightened man on a bucking deck has perhaps a second and a half to decide whether the thing screaming toward him is friend or death, and in that second and a half the eye goes to the pattern, not to the roundel, too small and too far. Not to the silhouette which betrayed everyone at Gela when a P-47 read like a Focke-Wulf in the dark, to the bands, 3 white, 2 black, wrapped bold around each wing and each fuselage, the crude hand-laid stripes doing precisely what they were engineered to do, resolving at distance into a single unmistakable message. The gunner reads them, and his finger comes off the trigger. Aircraft after aircraft comes in over the fleet and over the beach, and the guns that could have torn them from the sky stay silent. The wall of fire that consumed the 504th over Sicily does not come. The longest day unfolds with thousands of Allied aircraft passing over the most heavily armed water in the history of the world, and the great majority of them pass unfired upon, recognised, waved through by the simplest visual code ever painted onto metal. That is the triumph, and it is real. But it is not clean, and the men who lived it would be the last to let it be told as though it were. Because the stripes did not work perfectly. They worked well enough, which is a different and harder thing. The after-action reports that trickled up through the commands in the days after June 6th told a story that was overwhelmingly one of success, but they told it in the honest, jagged language of men who had watched the exceptions. There were gunners who fired on striped aircraft anyway. Not many, but some. Some of them had seen the June test flights and been briefed on the pattern, and still, in the moment, with a plane bearing down and their nerves stretched to the snapping point, they had squeezed the triggers before their eyes had finished reading. The stripes were an aid to judgment, not a replacement for it, and judgment under fire is a fragile instrument. A man who has spent the night watching for the Luftwaffe, who has heard the engines and felt the concussion of near misses and buried the memory of comrades lost to strafing runs, does not always wait for the pattern to resolve. Sometimes the fear fires the gun before the mind can intervene. The planners had known this. It was written into their models. They had never promised zero. They had promised better, dramatically, decisively better, and better was what the morning delivered. There were pilots who lost their stripes to the day itself. Battle damage tore at the markings, a burst of flak that peeled skin from a wing, a cannon shell that opened a fuselage and took a whole band of paint with it. Soot from the guns streaked the white until it greyed and blurred. And the whitewash, that improvised concoction of chalk and water and thin binder, mixed in buckets on rain-slicked tarmac 2 nights before, the whitewash was never meant to last. It had washed in streaks under the drizzle of June 4th. It had needed touching up at the last light of June 5th. And now, in the abrasion of flight and combat and weather, some of it thinned and faded and ran, so that a pilot who had crossed the channel wearing bold, clean bands might come home over the fleet wearing something patchier, greyer, harder to read. The men in the cockpits knew it. They reported it afterward. The anxiety of glancing back at a wing and wondering whether the stripes were still bold enough to save them, whether a distant gunner would see paint or see a target. The margin, which had always been thin, thinned further as the day wore on, and the paint wore off. And there were the transports. The C-47s of the troop carrier groups had received their orders first, on the evening of June 3rd, and had painted through the earliest hours. But even so, not every aircraft in every formation carried complete, correct markings on the night of the airborne drops. Some flew with partial stripes, some with markings applied in haste and darkness that did not conform to the pattern, some obscured by the loads slung beneath them. And the transports were the most vulnerable aircraft in the whole enterprise. They flew low and slow and straight, packed with paratroopers, unable to maneuver, unable to fight back, exactly the profile that had drawn the fire at Gela. The airborne operations of the night before D-Day saw their own losses, their own confusion, their own moments when a transport crossed a nervous formation of ships, and the old lethal chaos threatened to repeat itself. The stripes helped even there. But the transports remained what they had always been, the aircraft with the least margin, carrying the men with the most to lose, and the ones for whom the failure of recognition had already, once, been catastrophic. So the truth of the stripes on D-Day is not the triumph of a system that worked flawlessly. It is the harder, more human truth of a system that worked imperfectly, under enormous stress, and held, barely in places, by the thinness of a gunner's second glance and the boldness of a hand-laid band of chalk-white paint. The wall of fire that a veteran of Sicily called the lesson of the whole war, the lethal chaos of frightened men firing on their own, that wall did not vanish on June 6th. It was mitigated. It was pushed back. It was denied the harvest it had taken over Gila. But it was still there, still coiled in the trigger fingers of exhausted men, still capable of breaking through the recognition scheme in the moments when fear outran judgment. The stripes did not abolish the danger. They gave the eye a chance to win the race against the reflex, and on the morning of the 6th of June, over the largest fleet ever assembled, the eye won that race far more often than anyone had dared to hope. Pull back, then, from the individual cockpit and the individual deck gun, and look at the whole of that sky. On June 6, 1944, the Allied air forces flew 14,674 sorties. 14,674 times an aircraft rose from an English field or turned over the channel or bored in over the beaches, and each of those sorties was a passage through the airspace of a fleet primed to shoot at what it could not identify. Set that number against the baseline the planners had lived in fear of. Over Gila, a single formation of 144 transports had lost 23 aircraft and 318 men to friendly guns in a matter of minutes, a loss rate that, extrapolated across the scale of Overlord, had produced the projections Lee Mallory called unacceptable, the models that had made the whole desperate enterprise of the stripes seem not merely worthwhile but necessary. Against those projections, against that Sicily baseline, the friendly fire air losses of D-Day were not a catastrophe averted by luck. They were a catastrophe averted by design, by a code painted onto 11,000 aircraft in a single frantic night, and read, that morning, by the men who might otherwise have killed the pilots who wore it. The numbers speak, and what they say is this: the stripes worked. The saturation of IFF that the planners had feared came to pass exactly as modelled. Thousands of transponders shouting at once into an airspace that could not sort them, the electronic scheme of friend or foe collapsing under its own volume. The silhouette recognition that had failed over Sicily failed again, because it always fails, because a wing seen edge on at a mile in bad light is a wing and nothing more. What did not fail was the paint. The one system that survived the chaos of the largest air operation in history was the crudest one. The buckets and the brooms, the chalk and the binder, the hand and the eye. In an operation of unimaginable technological complexity, the thing that saved the most lives was a stripe of whitewash laid down by a tired man with a mop in the dark. And here is where the official record goes quiet, because the official record does not keep the names of the men with the mops. It records the sorties and the losses and the approvals and the orders. It records Lee Mallory, who signed the scheme on the 17th of May. It records the commanders and the squadrons and the aircraft by serial number. It does not record the crew chief at Leiston who mixed the whitewash in a bucket by the light of a shielded torch, cursing the rain, watching his fresh stripes bead and run, and knowing he would have to do it again in the morning. It does not record the armourer at Boxstead who set down his usual work and picked up a broom, because there were more fuselages than there were hands, and every one of them had to be striped before dawn. It does not record the mechanics who knelt on wet wings and dragged rollers across cold metal, without a tape measure between them, judging the width of each band by the width of the brush in their fist. 18 inches because the brush was about that wide, close enough, good enough. The stripes were never meant to be beautiful. They were meant to be seen, and they were. These men have no monument. Their work was, by its very nature, temporary, designed to be washed off, painted over, forgotten within weeks. It left no artifact that a museum could preserve, because the stripes that survive on restored aircraft today are precise and clean and masked. Nothing like the ragged hand-laid bands of the actual morning. The real work of June 6th was, in the most literal sense, painted out of existence within a month of its completion, and yet those anonymous hands working through that anonymous night did something that no committee and no commander could have done alone. They translated an idea into paint. They took the lesson written in the blood of the 504th over Sicily and laid it down, stroke by stroke, onto the wings that would fly over Normandy. Everything else in the story, the boards of inquiry, the after-action reports, lesson learned number 42, the yellow bands of the Mediterranean, the London committee rooms, Lee Mallory's signature, all of it was preparation. The consummation happened on the tarmac, in the dark, by men whose names dissolved into the general category of ground crew and were never written down. What was written down later was the testimony of the men who read their work. After the war, when the naval gunners who had crewed the anti-aircraft batteries of the invasion fleet came to tell what they had seen, they described the morning of June 6th in language that placed the stripes at the centre of everything. The stripes, they said, were how they knew. Not the recognition charts they had studied. Those were for the deliberate identification of an aircraft you had time to study, and over the beaches there was no time. Not the silhouettes. Those betrayed the eye. Not the IFF, which was somebody else's business, buried in the radar rooms, invisible to a man on a gun. The stripes were the thing a gunner could use in the second and a half he had. One veteran described them as being as big and bold as anything he had ever seen. Beacons, painted onto the sky itself. And the rule that the stripes made possible was as simple as the men who had to follow it in the heat of battle. If it ain't got stripes, shoot it down. That was the whole doctrine, reduced to a sentence a frightened man could hold in his head while the world came apart around him. If it has the bands, it is one of ours. If it does not, it is the enemy. No radio handshake, no transponder, no chart. Just the pattern, and the pattern was enough. There is a closing of a circle in that testimony that is almost unbearable to sit with. Because the men who fired on the 504th over Gila had wanted more than anything exactly what those Normandy gunners had, a way to know. They had not been murderers. They had been frightened men who had endured German air raids and who, when aircraft came over them in the dark, had no way to tell friend from foe and had chosen, in the terror of the moment, to shoot. The 318 dead and wounded of Sicily were not killed by malice. They were killed by the absence of a stripe, and 11 months later, over another beachhead, the stripe existed. And the men below could know, and because they could know, the pilots above them lived. The dead of Gela, buried first at Agrigento, and later carried to the American cemetery at Nettuno, above the Anzio beach where the same lesson was cruelly repeated, did not die for nothing. They died for the thing that was learned from their deaths. The paint that saved the pilots of D-Day was, in the most direct and traceable way, drawn from the graves of the paratroopers who had been killed for the want of it. Between the Sicily dead and the Normandy living runs a line as straight and clear as a band of whitewash, and it is impossible to look at the one without seeing the other at the far end. The stripes had a short life. They were creatures of a single moment, the invasion moment, the passage of an enormous striking force over an enormous defending fleet, the brief and terrible window in which the danger of friendly fire outweighed every other consideration, and once that window began to close, the stripes became a liability of a different kind. High-contrast bands of black and white splashed across the upper surfaces of a wing are precisely what a camouflage scheme is designed to prevent. They make an aircraft visible. which was the entire point over the fleet, and exactly the wrong quality once the aircraft was operating over enemy-held ground, where a German observer looking up wanted nothing more than a bold, unmistakable marking to track. Within a month of D-Day, as the beachhead was secured and the invasion hardened into a campaign, and then into an occupation of the liberated ground, the order came down to remove the stripes from the upper surfaces of the aircraft, so that camouflage could be restored against observation from above. The undersides kept their bands a while longer, where friendly gunners still needed to read them and enemy eyes could not. And by the end of 1944, the stripes were gone altogether, painted over, sanded off, dissolved back into the standard finishes of the air forces that had worn them. They had existed in their full form for a matter of weeks. They had done their work in a matter of hours, and then they vanished as they had always been meant to, leaving behind almost nothing a person could hold. But they left behind an idea, and the idea did not vanish. The stripes had established a principle that the air forces of the world would carry forward into every conflict that followed, that in the chaos of a crowded sky, over the guns of one's own side, a bold visual identification could do what no other system reliably could. The precedent set on the wings over Normandy became doctrine. It reappeared over Korea, where the F-86 Sabres flew with high visibility bands of their own, yellow this time wrapped around wing and fuselage in the same spirit, the same purpose, the direct descendants of the black and white of 1944. It threaded forward into the standardized tail codes that let a friendly aircraft be identified at a glance across a whole theatre, into the ever-refined protocols of IFF that grew out of the very failures the stripes had been invented to cover. The whole modern apparatus of not shooting your own, the visual codes, the electronic handshakes, the layered redundancy of recognition, traces part of its lineage back through those weeks in the summer of 1944 to a scheme born of the Gila dead and painted in the Normandy rain. The stripes themselves faded within the year. The lesson they carried never did. And so, at the end of all of it, the eye comes to rest not over the beaches, not over the fleet, not in the cockpit of a fighter crossing the channel at first light, but back on the wet tarmac of an English field in the small hours of a June night, 3 days before the invasion, in the place where the whole thing was actually decided. Picture it as it was, Boxted or Leiston, it hardly matters which. The same scene played out across 100 fields that night. The blackout total, no light permitted that a German bomber might see, so the work is done by shielded torches and by feel, the rain coming and going, cold, persistent, working against the men and against the paint. The smell of it, the raw chemical tang of the whitewash, the chalk and the water and the thin binder, mixed in buckets that clank and slosh as they are hauled from aircraft to aircraft. A crew chief on his knees on a cold wet wing, a brush in his fist, dragging a band of white across the metal, then a band of black beside it, working by the width of the brush because there is no tape and no time and no need for precision. His hands are cold, his back aches. He has been awake for longer than he can count, and he will be awake longer still, because there are more aircraft than there are hours, and every one of them must be striped before the light comes. He does not know what he is part of. He has not been told where these planes are going or when, only that the stripes must be on by dawn, and that they matter more than he can be told. He curses the rain when it beads on his fresh paint and starts to run. He does it again. He moves to the next wing. He will never leave England. He will not see the beaches or the fleet or the great grey armada spread across the channel. He will not know, that morning, whether his stripes held, whether a gunner 3 ships out read the pattern he laid down and lifted his finger from the trigger, whether a pilot he never met flew home because of a band of chalk-white paint dragged across a wing at 3 in the morning in the rain. His name is not in the record. his work was washed away within the month. And yet it is at least arguable, it is more than arguable, that the single most consequential act of air warfare on the 6th of June, 1944, did not happen in the sky over Normandy at all. It happened 3 nights earlier, on the ground, in the dark, in the rain, by men who never left England, kneeling on cold wings with brushes in their hands, translating the lesson of the Sicily dead into paint that would let the Normandy living come home. The stripes are gone now, sanded off and painted over 80 years ago, dissolved into the ordinary finishes of a war that ended and receded into history. But somewhere over the Channel on the morning of the longest day, in the grey light between the fleet and the sky, they did their work, and the guns held, and the pilots lived, and the wall of fire that took the 504th over Gila was this time denied. It was only paint. It was applied by hand in the dark by men whose names no one wrote down, and it was enough.